Imagínate esto por un momento. Son las 6 de la mañana en Japón. La ciudad todavía está en silencio, pero en una pequeña casa una madre ya está despierta. No está corriendo, no está estresada, no está diciendo, no tengo tiempo. Toma 12 minutos y empieza a ordenar. Primero una mesa, después un zapato fuera del lugar, luego una taza en la cocina. Nada espectacular, nada heroico. En Japón no creen que el orden empieza en la casa. Ellos creen que el orden empieza en la mente. Y cuando tu mente está en orden, tu casa cambia, tu disciplina cambia. Y finalmente, tu vida cambia. Hábitos tan simples, que parecen pequeños, pero tan poderosos, que pueden transformar el caos de tu casa en paz para tu mente. 12 minutos. Y hoy vas a descubrir por qué. Y remember a story someone once told me about a small home in Japan. Not a big house, not a perfect house. Just a normal place where a normal family lived their normal lives. But every morning something very unusual happened there. At 6 o'clock, before the city fully woke up, the mother of the house would quietly step into the living room. The sunlight had barely touched the windows yet. The streets outside were still calm. Most people were still asleep. And she would look around, not with frustration, not with stress, just awareness. A chair slightly out of place. An agony left on the table. A cup resting in the sink. Nothing dramatic, nothing terrible. Just a small evidence of life happening. She didn't sigh. She didn't complain. She didn't say, I don't have time. That was all she gave herself every day. 12 minutes to restore calm. She picked up the magazine and returned to the shelf. She aligned the chair with the table. She raised the cup and placed it on the rack. She folded a blanket someone had left on the sofa the night before. Slow movements, quiet movements, no rush. To someone watching from the outside, it would look almost insignificant. But something interesting happened over time. Her children began to notice. At first, they didn't say anything. They just watched their mother moving gently through the room each morning, correcting small things that no one else seemed to care about. One morning, the youngest son walked past the entrance and saw a pair of shoes near the door that didn't belong there. For a moment, you stared at them. It could have ignored them belong there. For a moment, he stared at them. It could have ignored them. 12 minutes. So I went down, lifted the shoes, and placed them where they belong. No plus, no announcement, no lecture. Just a small act of order. Days passed. Weeks passed. Weeks passed. The family never sat down to discuss the system. There were no strict rules taped to the refrigerator. No speeches about discipline. But slowly, something changed inside the house. The daughter started wiping the kitchen counter before going to school. The father began putting things back after using them. The son would once ignore the shoes, now automatic that the shoes now automatically adjusted the cushions on the sofa without thinking. And something even more interesting began to happen. The house started feeling lighter. Not because it was perfect clean, because it was cared for. You could walk into the living room at almost any moment of the day and feel something subtle in the atmosphere. A quiet sense of harmony, no perfection, just attention. Visitors sometimes ask the mother, how do you keep everything so organized? They expected a complicated answer. Maybe a system, maybe a schedule. Maybe a schedule. Maybe a schedule. Maybe a schedule. Maybe hours of cleaning. But she would simply smile and say something that sounded almost too simple. 12 minutes? Some people laughed. 12 minutes? That sounded deep. But that was exactly the point. It wasn't about cleaning a house. It was about teaching a mindset. You see, chaos doesn't arrive in one day. It grows slowly. A shirt on a chair today, a dish in the sink tomorrow. A pile of things on the table next week. Little by little, disorder grows. But order grows the same way. One object returned, one surface clear, one small decision repeated every day. And what started as 12 minutes of movement eventually became something deeper inside that family. Awareness, responsibility, respect for space. The children grew older. Life became busier. School schedules changed. Work hours shifted. Responsibilities increased. But they have stayed. Not because but because it had quietly become part of who they were. Years later, the youngest son moved into his own apartment in another city. The first night there, after unpacking his things, he sat on the couch and looked around. Books on the table, a jacket on the chair, a cup beside the sink. He checked the time, 6 o'clock in the evening. And without thinking about it, he stood up, he straightened the jacket, he washed the cup, he placed the books neatly on a shelf. 12 minutes passed. When he finished, the apartment felt different. Not bigger, not fancier, just calm and in that moment, there meant something his mother never actually said out loud, but had demonstrated every single morning. Order is not something you wait to have time for. Order is something you create to have time. He also had a small story from a teacher who had visited a school in Japan. Nothing extraordinary about the building. The classrooms looked simple. Wooden desks, a chalkboard, windows that let in the quiet morning light. But what caught his attention was something very small. But what caught his attention was something most people would never notice. When the students arrived that morning, they entered the classroom one by one. They greeted the teacher politely, placed their desks, and sat down. Everything seemed normal, until the teacher noticed a single shoe near the door. Just one shoe. It had probably slipped off someone's foot that earlier during recess the previous day, or maybe a younger student had kicked it aside while running through the hallway. It wasn't blocking the door. It wasn't creating a big mess. It was put there. A small thing, an unimportant thing. The visiting teacher watched as the students began preparing for the day. Some opened their notebooks, others quietly spoke to their friends, and for a few minutes, no one touched the shoe. It remained there like a silent question. Then a boy entered the room slightly late. He bowed quickly to the teacher and rushed inside clearly. Trying not to attract attention. As he stepped forward, his eyes briefly noticed the shoe. He paused. Only for a second, the teacher expected him to ignore it. After all, it wasn't his shoe. It wasn't his responsibility. He was only late. But the boy slowly bent down. He picked up the shoe with both hands. He looked around quietly, then walked to the small shoe rack near the entrance and placed it neatly beside the others. No one clapped. No one said anything. The boy simply returned to his desk and opened his notebook. The teacher who was visiting felt something strange in that moment. Because what he had just seen felt something strange in that moment. Because what he had just seen was not about a shoe. It was about a decision. Later that day, during lunch, he asked one of the school staff members something that had been on his mind. Why did that boy pick up the shoe if it wasn't his? The staff member smiled gently. He didn't pick it up because it was his, she said. He picked it up because it was his, as he said. He picked it up because it was out of place. And for a long time. Because in many places, people wait for ownership before taking responsibility. If it's my mess, I clean it. If it's my problem, I solve it. If it's my shoe, I move it. But here, something different seemed to exist. Responsibility wasn't connected to possession. It was connected to awareness. The teacher remembered something else. He had noticed earlier, remembered something else. He had noticed earlier that day, before classes began, the students themselves had cleaned the classroom. Not a janitor, the students. Some swept the floor. Others wiped the desks. A small group cleaned the hallway. And none of them complained. They didn't treat cleaning as punishment. They treated it as normal life. So when a shoe appeared in the wrong place, the question was never, who left it there? The question was simply, why is it still there? And that difference changes everything. Because discipline is not loud. It doesn't announce itself with big speeches or strict rules shouted across a room. Discipline often appears in the quietest moments. A hand reaching down to move something small. A hand reaching down to move something small. A person choosing order instead of convenience. Someone noticing what everyone else walks past. The visiting teacher returned to his country weeks later, but that tiny moment stayed with him. One shoe, one boy, one small decision. Months later, he was walking through his own school hallway when he noticed something similar. A piece of paper lying on the floor. Students walked past it without looking. Some stepped over it without slowing down. He kept walking too. But after a few steps, the memory returned to him. The shoe near the door. The boy bending down. He stopped walking. He turned around slowly, walked back, and picked up the paper. He threw it into the trash bin nearby. And for a moment, he felt on something unusual. Not pride. Just awareness. Because awareness. Because awareness. Because awareness. Because awareness. Because awareness. It becomes disorganized in big dramatic ways. It becomes disorganized through thousands of tiny moments when people decide something is not their problem. A cup left on a table, a jacket thrown on a chair, a shoe left near the door. Small things that quietly accumulate, but order begins the same way. One small correction, one simple choice, one moment where someone decides that even the smallest detail deserves attention. One moment where someone decides that even the smallest detail deserves attention. And sometimes the most powerful lesson about discipline is hidden inside something so simple that most people would walk past it without ever noticing. A single shoe resting quietly near the door. Many years ago, a man traveled to Japan for work. It was his first time in the country, and everything around him felt different. The streets were quiet, the trains arrived exactly on time, and even the smallest neighborhoods seemed to carry a sense of calm that he could not fully explain. One evening, after a long day of meetings, one of his Japanese colleagues invited him to visit his home for dinner. The man expected something impressive. Maybe a large house, maybe a place that looked like the houses he had seen. Now it seems perfect furniture, beautiful decorations, expensive designs. But when they arrived, the house was very simple. A small wooden entrance, narrow hallway, soft light coming through paper screens. Nothing luxurious. The host asked him politely to remove his shoes before entering. The guest stepped inside and noticed something interesting right away. The space felt peaceful, not silent like an empty room, but peaceful like a place where life moved gently. They sat at a low table while the host's wife brought tea. The children were quietly doing homework in the corner of the room. The guest looked around. A few books on a shelf, a small plant near the window, a folded blanket on the sofa. There were toys, school, bags, and everyday objects, but everything seemed to belong exactly where it was. He finally said something that had been on his mind. Your house feels very calm. It feels balanced. It feels balanced. The host looked around the room for a moment before answering. You are not feeling the house, he said quietly. You are feeling the people inside it. The guest didn't understand immediately. The host continued speaking slowly, almost like he was telling a story rather than explaining an idea. When people inside a home are rushed, angry, distracted, or overwhelmed, the house begins to reflect that. The guest looked at the table, thinking about his own home, thousands of kilometers away. The host gently moved a cup closer to the center of the table. When the mind is chaotic, he said, objects begin to move without care. A book left open, a jacket dropped on a chair, dishes forgotten in the sink. None of these things seem important at first. They look like small details, but they slowly begin to shape the atmosphere of a place. The host stood up and walked to the shelf near the wall. One of the books was slightly tilted forward. He gently pushed it back into alignment with the others. My father used to say something when I was a child. He continued. He said, the house listens to your heart. The guest smiled slightly at the idea, unsure whether it was meant literally or symbolically. When your heart is restless, the host said, the house becomes restless. When your heart is restless, the host said, the house becomes restless. When your heart is calm, the house becomes calm. The guest thought about mornings in his own home, rushing through breakfast, looking for lost keys, papers scattered across the table, shoes missing near the door. Everyone moving quickly, voices slightly tense, time always running out. He had always well. Leave the house was messy because life was busy. But now a different thought appeared. Maybe the house was messy because the mind inside it was busy. Later that evening, after dinner, the children began quietly putting away their books. One of them folded the blanket on the sofa and placed it neatly on their armrest. No one told them to do it. The guest watched carefully. The movements were calm, almost natural, as if they were simply completing the rhythm of the day. Before leaving, the guest stood once more near the entrance while putting his shoes back on. He looked again at the living room behind him. The same furniture, the same small space. But the feeling inside it was something he could not easily describe. It wasn't about decoration. It wasn't about size. It was something invisible. On the train ride back to his hotel, the man kept thinking about what the host had said. You are not feeling the house. You are feeling the people inside it. The next morning, he woke up early and looked around his hotel room. A shirt on the chair, his bag half open on the floor, a cup beside the bed. He slowly stood up, he folded the shirt, he placed the bed near the desk. He threw away the empty cup. Nothing dramatic happened. But the room felt slightly different afterward. Not bigger, not cleaner in an impressive way. Just quieter. And in that quiet moment, he began to understand something simple that he had overlooked for years. Sometimes the state of a home is not a reflection of how much time people have. It is a reflection of the state of mind they bring into the space where they live every day. Many years ago, a young man moved to Tokyo to begin his first job. Like many young people starting a new chapter in life, he arrived with big dreams and a small apartment. The apartment was tiny, just one room, a narrow kitchen, and a window that overlooked a busy street where trains passed every few minutes. At first, everything felt exciting. New city, new job, new life. But within a few weeks, reality began to appear. His job demanded long hours. The trains were crowded every morning. By the time he returned home at night, he felt completely exhausted. So he began to postpone small things. One evening, he left a bowl in the sink. The next day, he left his jacket on the chair. A few days later, some papers from work stayed on the table. None of it seemed important. After all, he told himself the same thing many people say, I'll fix it when I have time. But time passed quickly. Days became weeks. And slowly, the small apartment began to change. Not dramatically, not in a way that would shock someone walking inside. But something subtle shifted. The sink was rarely empty. The chair was almost always covered with clothes. The table carried a quiet collection of papers, notebooks, and small objects. Didn't the tact had never returned to their place? The apartment started never returned to their place. The apartment started feeling heavy. One night after a particular difficult day at work, the young man returns home late. The trains had been delayed, his boss had criticized his report, and rain had followed him all the way from the station. When he opened the door to his apartment, he stopped for a moment. The room looked exactly the way it had for weeks, but for some reason that night it felt different. It felt overwhelming. He stepped inside carefully, avoiding the stack of papers on the table. His bag landed on the chair on top of the other clothes. He sat on the edge of his bed and sighed. The room wasn't big enough to ignore everything was visible. Every unfinished task, every small decision he had postponed. He stared at the sink for a moment. 2 bowls, 1 cup, a pair of chopsticks, such small things, yet they felt strangely heavy. At that moment, he remembered something his grandfather had once told him when he was a child. His grandfather had grown up in a small village where life moves slowly and people believe strongly in discipline. The old man used to say something that sounded simple, but carried a deeper meaning. Life becomes difficult when small efforts disappear. The young man had never fully understood those words before. But that night, sitting in the middle of his small apartment, he began to see what his grandfather meant. He stood up slowly. He walked to the sink. He washed the bowl, then the second bowl, then the cup. The water ran quietly while he worked. After that, he picked up the clothes from the chair and folded them. He placed the papers in a small stack. None of it took very long. 10 minutos maybe, kaiting. But when he finished, he looked around the room again. Something had changed. The apartment had not become luxurious. It had not become luxurious. It had not become perfect. But it had become lighter. He sat down again, this time without the feeling of pressure surrounding him. That night, he made a quiet decision. Not a big promise solution. That night, he made a quiet decision. Not a big promises. Not a dramatic resolution. Just a simple rule. Every day, he would do one small thing before going to sleep. One dish washed a small effort. One object returned. One surface clear. Nothing heroic. Just a small effort. Days passed. Some nights, he only had the energy to clean one thing. Other nights, he organized the desk or folded laundry. But he never allowed the small efforts to disappear again. Weeks later, a friend visited his apartment for the first time. The friend looked around and smiled. "But you must spend a lot of time cleaning," he said. The young man laughed softly. "No," he replied. "I spend a little time every day." The friend nodded, but he didn't fully understand the difference. Because many people believe order requires large blocks of time. A free weekend. A long afternoon. A sudden burst of motivation. But the young man had discovered something else. Order grows through repetition. But the young man had discovered something else through consistency. Through the small effort repeated again and again when nobody's watching. Months later, the routine became automatic. When he finished dinner, he washed the bowl immediately. When he removed his jacket, he placed it on a hanger. When he finished reading, the book returned to the shelf. The apartment never again reached the chaotic state it once had. Not because he had more time, but because he had changed something inside his daily rhythm. He had stopped waiting for the perfect moment to fix everything, and instead began protecting the perfect moment to fix everything, and instead began protecting the small moments that quietly prevent everything from falling apart.